Hi, everyone. My name is William Tomé. I'm the president of CFA Society Emirates, and I'm honored to host a call today on the geopolitics of the region. This call is co-hosted by CFA Society Emirates, CFA Society Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, and Oman. So it's a collaborative approach to keeping our members aware of what's happening. And we selected the best for this call. So Andrew Bishop is a dear friend of the CFA societies in the region. He spoke at several events hosted in the region, and the most important one was the MENA Investment Congress that happened last year. So let me introduce Andrew quickly. He's a senior partner and global head of policy research at Signum Global Advisors. He is an established political analyst with at least 15 years of experience and track record advising institutional investors, corporates, and governments on political risks in developed, emerging, and frontier markets. Andrew is also head of Signum's Washington, D.C. office. He joined Signum from EuroAsia Group, where he served as a deputy head of research and was also a director in the firm's global macro practice. Andrew, welcome to the call. We would appreciate a quick intro of what happened recently with the last 24 hours before we dive into a few questions that I prepared and a few questions that we receive. So I encourage everyone to use the chat box to submit the questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much for having me, William. Really appreciate the opportunity. I will keep the introduction, as we said, very, very short. Basically, our view when this war started was, and there was this whole debate about what are Trump's goals, right? What is he trying to achieve? Our view was he is entering this war with the minimalist goals, not regime change. Destroy the ballistic missile program and get out, right? And the logic here was, yes, he is emboldened enough to start a war with Iran, even with the midterm 6 months away. But that doesn't mean that he has abandoned this idea that he likes super short and sweet conflicts, like in Venezuela, right? Problem, of course, for him is after less than a week, the Strait of Hormuz was closed, and then the entire goal of the war becomes reopening Hormuz. At that stage, you only have two options: reopen it diplomatically or reopen it forcefully. Our working hypothesis, our base case, let's say, is that he's going to go for the diplomatic option, and we've been saying this since before yesterday's tweets. The reason is that the forceful options are all very, very imperfect. So very concretely, taking Karg Island would be extremely difficult militarily. Most of the folks we speak to here in Washington, D.C. on the military side basically say it's not impossible, but you don't want to do that, right? Lots of casualties, lots of risk. The second option is a blockade. So basically trying to take Iranian tankers and say, we will only give you your oil if you or your tankers and allow you to export your oil if you reopen Hormuz. The problem with both of those, the second one is much more feasible. Frankly, it's actually quite easy to do. But the problem with both of those is that it still amounts to leaving Iran in control of Hormuz. You're just getting them to open it, but they still control it, right? So they can close it again anytime. So the only real military option, like a sustainable military option, or a game-changing, let's say, is to physically take Hormuz itself, not Karg, not blockade, physically take the strait. The problem there is, honestly, I think militarily it's doable. The problem is you then own it. So you then are engaged in a forever war, like almost by definition. And we don't think Trump wants to do that. To be very clear, when I say we don't think he wants to do that, I don't think there's a zero chance, right? But I think it's 25, 30% chance, not 51 plus. As a result of all of this, we think he wants a deal with Iran. And we were not surprised by his move yesterday. Our sense is that Mr. Khalibaf can go on Twitter and deny as much as he wants. There's too much dialogue going on, too many phone calls, too many exchanges, too many Wall Street Journal articles for there not to actually be talks going on. There are clearly talks going on. So this is where we stand, and we're relatively optimistic overall. The caveat, and I'll stop here since we agreed to keep this very short, the caveat is I think we can only get a deal if it's a ceasefire. If basically the US says, I stop bombing you and you reopen Hormuz. If the Trump administration is really trying to get a pre-war nuclear deal about, dismantling nuclear facilities and this and that, then it's not going to go anywhere because Iran doesn't have total upper hand, but has enough upper hand to not make those kinds of concessions right now. So again, I'll keep it very short, and I'm sure we're going to have a good dialogue.
Great. Andrew, excuse me. It's been few months where I needed to revise my geography and international law, and I'm a bit lost. Maybe you'll help me to find my way. Isn't the Strait of Hormuz mostly Omani waters? You keep on saying owned by US, owned by Iran. I need to revise my geography, I'm sure.
Yeah. So, I mean, I think we're very clearly in the world of might makes right, whether it be Iranian might or US might. So, I'm not taking a side as to who is right or wrong. But factually speaking, today Iran controls Hormuz, and potentially tomorrow the US controls Hormuz. But there is no world, I think, in which Oman controls Hormuz. Interestingly, though, Oman is probably the one, in our base case, actually, Oman is probably the one that would act as a convener for let's all take a deep breath and agree on some sort of regulation for how Hormuz is managed, etc.
Great. I have another naive question. I thought Israel and the US attacked Iran, and what I don't understand is why civilians and infrastructure in the GCC has been under attack. This one I never understood.
So I think there's two interpretations, one that is more commonly made than the other. The commonly made one is it's what's the word I'm looking for, like blackmail or leverage to try to put pressure on the US, right? I think there's some truth to that, but unfortunately, for also what comes next, I think there's more to it. I think that this war has revealed or has fully made blatant, right? Let's say the fact that the Iranian leadership has quite strong hate for many of the Gulf countries. And that's both because of the fact that they're more developed and successful and liberal and this and that. But it's also for geostrategic reasons of, many Gulf countries having essentially fought Iran in Syria and elsewhere through proxies, of course, right? So unfortunately, I think it's both of those. And the latter is more worrying for what goes forward, right? For what comes next.
You mentioned ongoing negotiations, even though some parties would deny it. Will the Iranian regime survive to continue negotiations?
Yes, I am very skeptical of this narrative that the current leadership in Iran is completely atomized, in chaos. No one knows how to reach Moshtaba, etc. If you look at who's in charge, head of the IRGC, Mr. Khalibaf, the people around Mr. Moshtaba Khamenei, they are all legacy players. So let me put it this way: a lot of legacy players have been killed, but all of the still existing players are legacy players. So they are very much people who understand and own, like they are the owners of the system. So I'm very skeptical of the narrative that they can't make decisions and they're, in complete disarray. What I think is true, however, is that the narrative that Iran feels so emboldened that it will never agree to a deal, etc., because now they control Hormuz and they have this magical card. I think this is overstated because maybe I'm ascribing too much rationality to the regime, but I think the regime understands that today is their peak leverage. If they continue and they get bombed every single day and Israel destroys the Basij leadership every single day for the next 6 months, they will eventually lose power. And so I think they actually understand the importance of taking a tactical de-escalation.
Great. I'll start taking questions from the audience because they're very interesting questions. What's the time frame you are looking for a ceasefire? And secondly, would Iran agree on a ceasefire or insist to continue?
Yeah. So I mean, time frame is what you see is what you get, right? Let's say 8 days, right? And then the next week. But on the, and by the way, interestingly, not non-negligible. I think it's also quite plausible we get a ceasefire and then the war restarts, right? So these are two separate issues. Do we get a ceasefire or not? And does the Gulf return to stability or not? Two completely different questions. And I'm obviously more optimistic on the former than on the latter. On Iran's position, so I touched on it just briefly a minute ago, that I think the Iranians are maybe more aware of their non-invincibility, right? And of course also of their peak leverage. So basically, the Iranian leaders understand that yeah, today they control Hormuz, but if they don't agree to a deal, Trump will probably try to take it. So maybe they kill a bunch of Americans, but I think they're smart enough to understand that at the end of the day, they will not be in charge of Hormuz the way that they are today, right? Whereas if they stop the war, they actually continue to control Hormuz, which of course is a key concern in the Gulf, right? Needless to say. So yes, I think that they are probably willing to take a deal. What I'm less optimistic about is, like I mentioned earlier, I don't think they're going to make structural concessions, right, on nuclear and missiles, etc. I think the best we can get is a ceasefire.
It almost answers the next question that was, would Iran have the upper hand on the negotiations? And this question is interesting because what happens next, what the new day looks like when it all starts, what the GCC regional tensions would be and their relationship with the US.
So yeah, so I want to touch on something. Maybe it's a bit of a segue or tangential to the question, but this notion I hear a lot, especially in Abu Dhabi, to be honest, more so than elsewhere in the Gulf, that we cannot end the war here with Iran still having the upper hand, right? Like now that if you go for broke, you have to finish the job. And the reason I'm skeptical of this, and I'm sure there's very, very strong different opinions in the audience, the reason I'm skeptical of this narrative is twofold. Number one, what does it mean to finish the job? Does it mean toppling the regime? Because then maybe we have to fight for 2 years. Does it mean making sure that Iran can never launch a drone again against Dubai? Because this is not doable. Iran will always be able to produce drones in a basement or in a garage. Like you can order the components on Alibaba, right? So what does it mean? And then the second question is, even if one is ready to take that risk, let's fight Iran to the death, right? Make sure that they are never again a threat. I think there's a case to be made that that's easier to do if you spend 6 months first building out a drone wall, building out supply routes to the Mediterranean, basically making the Gulf more resilient to be able to fight this longer war, right? And this goes to a last point, which is this war is often depicted as like the last war, right? It's the now or never. And I don't think that's true, fortunately or unfortunately. Unfortunately, I don't think that's true. I think quite plausible, quite likely, is that we get a ceasefire and then we get another war after the midterms, for example.
Thanks. We have another interesting question. Is the Strait of Hormuz closed more physically or practically due to the insurance companies not insuring shipments in the Gulf, etc.? If an agreement is reached to open the strait, will the perceived transportation risk revert back to pre-war level or remain escalated for some time?
So, on the first question, it would be nice to think that it's all psychological, but my understanding is that Iran has laid mines. And so I think as part of any deal, like I mentioned, any ceasefire, you would have to have Iran unmining the strait or demining the strait. The good news is they can do it because these are the types of mines where you know their location. I mean, nothing is ever perfect, but they're not like the floating mines. So that's the answer to the first one. The answer to the second one is no, definitely the insurance premia, et cetera, are not going back to pre-war. But I do think that there would be sufficient confidence that flows would pick back up. Um, and I say this in particular because, well, not in particular, but I say this because I think that as part of any deal, as you know, Iran has claimed that it hasn't closed Hormuz, right? So I think they would have to go a step further than just saying, oh, no, no, Hormuz has always been open. I think they would basically say, we guarantee safe passage. If a ship blows up, it's on us. It's our fault, right? Yeah. And why would they do that? To stop being bombed.
I have another interesting question. Irrespective of the outcome of the ongoing geopolitical conflict, what could be the potential impact on long-term GCT risk profile or say credit rating?
It's not good. You know, this debate is the image of Dubai forever broken, etc. Where I'll come down on this is the following. The Gulf countries, unlike 99% of post-war countries, are going to be in an amazing position because all the fundamentals are there. Rule of law, capital, you know, human capital, stability, political stability, transparency, all of the fundamentals are there. So Dubai or the Gulf more generally is not going down the drain, nowhere near that. But I do think that the perpetual growth, right, this sort of idea that the sky's the limits, that has disappeared. The way I would put it, this is a very, maybe I shouldn't even say this, but it's a very, very controversial metaphor. But I think the Gulf is going to be a little bit like Israel, which is highly developed, great place to do business, very smart people, very high tech, stable 90% of the time, but you know that there's threats all around. You know that every couple years there will probably be some rockets. There will be 6 weeks or so where people, leave the country, etc.
Interesting. You mentioned Israel, and there's a question. Will Israel agree with a ceasefire if one gets agreed between Iran and the USA?
I think very much so. And it's not a judgment on Israel being dovish or this or that. It's for two reasons. One, I think Israel absolutely has the capability to bomb Iran without US support, but it doesn't have the ability to keep going with a high intensity war like this without US support. Whether it be from refueling, intelligence standpoint, defense standpoints, Israel needs the US to keep this war going. Which gets to the second point, which is, again, I think Israel doesn't view this as the last war. I think Israel views this, from a game theory perspective, as a repeat game. And so if they think that they will need US support again in 6 months or again in 2 years, they have every incentive to keep Trump happy. And this is exactly what happened last June. Israel wanted to keep the war going. Trump said halas, and Israel said, okay, we're going to comply because we know we're going to need him in 6 months to bomb Iran again, right? So yes, I think that Israel would agree.
I have a very interesting question. How do we distinguish between ideological narratives like jealousy and the more widely cited geopolitical drivers, such as Iran responding to US/Israel actions, the presence of military bases in the Gulf, or efforts to deter threats to its regimes?
Ah, the way I tend to look at it is that the emotional stuff increases the bar for the other stuff, but the other stuff drives it, drives the decisions. So structural factors always drive outcomes, but how quickly or easily you get there depends on the emotions, right? It's kind of like, if you think, I think there's actually sociological literature on this, which is you can strike a deal between two people who have zero trust with one another. It's just going to take 10 times longer.
Great. We have someone who remembers what Charles Myers, the founder of Signum, said last October in Abu Dhabi at the MENA Investment Congress. He raised an interesting point that the Trump put has effectively shifted from equities to 10 years treasuries. Given the sharp move in bond yields yesterday, do you think that it's what actually prompted Trump's softer tone on negotiations? Is the bond market now the real pressure point driving policy signaling rather than equities? What does it mean for this war?
So bonds over equities, yes, but I think markets overall, bonds or equities, or oil prices, is not enough to bend Trump in this case. I think what is going to bend Trump is so it's less about like short-term movements or even the midterms. It's more about what it does to his legacy. So oftentimes you hear the arguments, Trump is not going to stop because for his legacy he needs to destroy the regime completely, right? Well, a very strong counter to that is Trump might not want to keep the war going because for his legacy it's not good to have 3 years of recession or to have 50 like 500 troops dead on Karg Island and so on and so forth. So I think it's more than just the short term of the market moves, but it's still political pressure at the end of the day.
Um, Honestly, all interesting questions. One, how do you see the situation shaping up within the context of domestic pressures for Trump and Netanyahu?
So Trump, I think we more or less discussed it, and also maybe one point to add is I sometimes get this question like, if he walks away now, doesn't he look like an idiot domestically? So the answer there is twofold. Number one, actually, yes, but if he continues the war, he looks even more like an idiot, right? Or he will face even more pushback. Because potentially, let's say that I'm too skeptical, right? I don't give him enough credit. Potentially, let's say he succeeds in toppling the regime or in taking over Hormuz or whatever. Great, but that's going to come at a cost and it's not going to be quick, right? So it's a very, very high risk reward. And then the second thing is, I think that no one in the US will call him out. So what I mean by that is everyone wants this war to end. It's very similar to including Republicans, right? It's very similar to the tariffs. where people said, "Oh, but tariffs is his number one agenda item. If he tacos on tariffs, this was before he started tacoing like crazy, right? If he tacos on tariffs, like doesn't don't people say, are you being hypocritical? Like you promised us tariffs. No one is going to say you promised us war. No, people want to move on. So I think he's pretty resilient. For Israel, I mean, I'm sure you've seen like the war is extremely popular. This does a lot of good to Netanyahu domestically. The two caveats I would say are one, I do think that it's diminishing returns for Netanyahu as well. I.e., if the war continues, I'm sure you've seen all the studies or the commentary that the Iranian missiles are getting through better over time. There's more casualties. And also, something that's starting to pop up in the Israeli media is, well, why are we not achieving the goals of the war, right? We're 3 weeks in and Iran is still launching missiles. What's going on here? So I do think there's diminishing returns. And then the second caveat with the election coming up in Israel in mind is it true that the war is good for Netanyahu's strongman image? Yes. But the problem for him is his competitors in the election are also strongman people, right? They're not doves. So he cannot say, like, vote for me, the dove, because Mr. Bennett is weak. Bennett wanted to bomb Iran long before it was popular.
The following question is curious about your thoughts on persistent uptick in inflation expectations due to the increased treasury buybacks from the Fed and their effects on commodities, especially softs, since they do usually lag energy prices, and if that effect is going to change with the de-escalation efforts.
So you get to an interesting point, which is there's the quantitative pain and then there's the qualitative threshold, i.e., every day so far we've had more and more pain on US gasoline prices and bond yields and this and that. But nothing has broken in the system. And I think that if the war continues for too long, and you saw it a little bit with the Qatari LNG train breaking apart or being taken offline or being damaged durably, let's say, not just taken offline, you potentially get to a tipping point where even if the war stops tomorrow, the consequences will be irreversible. And I think Trump is aware of that. And this gets to a key difference. Before the war, I thought Trump would only start bombing about a month later. Like I thought he was going to drag his feet a bit more, right? And the reason was that I thought Trump wanted to see if there was a way out of this without going to war because of the economic cost. And so you could say, well, that was, like clearly he didn't care. He doesn't care about these economic costs. He's willing to take the risk. The difference is before the war, when people gave him negative scenarios, right? When the military said, oh, if you do this, you're going to have oil prices, etc. He had every reason to say, no, you're just being pessimistic. Like, look at Fordow, look at Venezuela. Everything always plays out great when I do it. Now he can't say that. It's in his face, right? He sees that there is an economic cost to this war. So he can't just ignore it.
So there's a question here, but allow me to twist it a bit. If US and Israel, um, let's say the US signs a ceasefire with Iran and they agree on something, but you mentioned earlier they're going to attack later on. So why would Iran sign on it, on anything if they know they're going to be attacked just immediately after 6 months or a year or two?
So I would say for two reasons. One is because, like the Gulf that will build a drone wall and resilience routes to the Mediterranean, the Iranians will have time to rearm and regroup. I mean, you know, it's interesting because I get this question a lot, like, oh, if Iran right now is sort of in the thick of the war, why not keep going? But honestly, if I tell you you have 12 months to prepare better, wouldn't you want to prepare better for the next war rather than just keep bombing tomorrow and the day after? The second thing is again, like I don't know if they can really sustain this, frankly. Like I think that people have a tendency to underappreciate how hard they're getting hit. I mean, I don't want to sound like Trump, right? But they're losing a lot of military capabilities. So I don't know. Basically I'm a bit skeptical of this narrative that they have the upper hand. They have the upper hand in a negative sum game, right? But a negative sum game hurts them as well.
It almost looks like, if you allow me, the picture of you're a diver and you're a sophisticated diver. You got hold of an octopus, but with the tentacles, they're harming you and your friends around you. So It doesn't look nice. So you want to get rid of the octopus. You don't want to kill the octopus anymore. You want to harm as much as possible, but you're suffering in the meantime. Will there be reparations? Can Iran hope for reparations after this horrible war?
So the short version is yes, because they will not be called reparations for obvious reasons, but they would be called sanctions relief. And already the U.S. is taking a pretty interesting backdoor approach to sanctions relief and to easing the pain on Iran. So basically, if the question is, can there be bribes for Mr. Khalibaf? Yes, is the answer.
Okay, which reminds me, an original question I had, like Iran and Russia now can sell their oil, but the GCC aren't able to sell it because the Strait of Hormuz is blocked.
That's correct.
How
Which,
correct
which
is it sorry, go ahead.
very briefly, um, China. I think China is likely putting pressure on Iran to reopen Hormuz as well, because the dominant talking point is, oh, but China gets all its oil from Iran, right? Because the Iranian oil is still flowing. So why would China care? Plus, China likes the fact that the US is getting hit, right? Or hurt. I'm very skeptical of this narrative because China is not getting any of its Middle Eastern oil except the Iranian oil. So all the Iraqi oil and all this stuff is China's not getting. So that's not good for China. And then China is now paying 2 times the price for all the non-Middle Eastern oil that it is getting. So the discount that Russia used to offer China, for example, has disappeared. So for China, this is not a great situation either. And yeah, I'm sure they love that Trump is getting hit, right? A little bit. It's sort of Schadenfreude, but that only lasts so long because again, if there's no deal and Trump attacks Hormuz, there's only two bad scenarios for China. Either the war lasts forever, like it's a quagmire, and then China still doesn't get its oil, and now it doesn't even get the Iranian oil, or the US succeeds, but then if the US succeeds, the US is not in control of Hormuz. That's not good for China.
I did ask you how do Iran claim reparation, and you mentioned through the fact of that they have less sanctions. What about the GCC? Who can fix the harm that the GCC endured in this horrible war?
No one, which is why I think several parts of the GCC are very, very reluctant to end the war here. The question, though, is always the counterfactual. So if the war ends here, it's really bad for the GCC, for stability, long-term security, etc. But if the war continues, is that better? Because the war will continue for months, right? It's two bad choices.
Okay, I promised you that I will read all the questions and make sure I'm fair and transparent. So there's an interesting one. How correct it is to say that the US attacked Iran with preempting that Hormuz will be closed, which made US having more control on energy choke points and nukes are just an excuse, an energy business competition between US and Gulf countries?
I think don't ever ascribe a strategy where you can ascribe idiocy. Trump is not that strategic a thinker.
Do you think he'll survive politically after this war?
Yes, because I think he has very very good political instincts, and yes, I think he's Teflon done, right? There's no question about it. But he was facing a tough midterms in any case, so it's sort of like what I'm saying is this war is not going to bury him, but he was already under pressure.
And is this bad for Israel and its policy in the region?
No, I think Israel is I think what you see is what you get with Israel. Their number one priority with this goal was with this war was to destroy the Iranian missile program, and they will not achieve perfection, but it'll be pretty close. Like they'll have destroyed maybe 70%, 80% of the ballistic missile program, and that's pretty good for them because this I think is often missed. Even the June war of last year, there's a very strong case to be made that that war started because of what Israel discovered about Iran's ballistic missile program, not because of nukes. No one seriously believes that Iran was 2 weeks away from a nuke. But people do think that that Iran had started building a lot more missiles, and that's a real threat for Israel. Most Israelis, like if you ask them deep down, to be honest, they admit that Iran's not going to nuke Israel anytime soon, but launch ballistic missiles at Tel Aviv, yeah, very much so. So the missile program is a bigger threat, I would say, than the nuclear program.
I have lots of questions, Andrew, so I'll ask you to be sharp like always, but swift as possible. If this is not the last war, how do you see Iran preparing for the next round?
Full scale is asymmetrical. Like, I'm not even sure they will try to rebuild their ballistic missiles. They will just try to produce hundreds of thousands of drones so that no matter how good the air defense systems in the Gulf, if you can intercept 98% of drones, but Iran sends 100,000 drones, that's still thousands of drones that hit the Gulf.
I love the following question. Is the Gulf states not responding to Iran's attack a strength or a weakness?
Mm. No, overall, I think it's a weakness. Now, it might be the smart move. I'm not judging, but it's a weakness because if you're attacked and you don't respond, it's typically because you have a reason to fear the escalation, like or to be reluctant to go there, right? It's not just about wisdom.
What's your view on interceptor stockpile with Israel and Gulf countries in terms of how much time till the region can withstand the attacks from Iran and vice versa, missile and drone stockpile and launcher capability from Iran?
Yeah, so I think Iran will, I think if you have the war continuing for another couple months, Iran will stop being able to launch missiles in the short term, but it will still be able to launch drones, and so the net impact is not very different. That's on the Iranian side. On the Gulf side, I don't think the Gulf is going to run down to zero. We're not going to run. You're not going to run out of interceptors. But the problem is more what I was mentioning before, which is, sorry, and why not? Because interceptors are no longer being used as much, right? So, as you know, helicopters shooting down drones, French Mirage, Ukrainian drone decoys, etc. The problem is volume. Problem is volume, which is it's a numbers game. So Ukraine gets hit by 5,000 drones, or Russia launches 5,000 drones per month on Ukraine, and they intercept about 90% of them. So that still means 500 drones hit Ukraine every month.
So I mentioned the societies that are behind this great call, but we have also members from other societies attending the call, and they're asking, what are your views on oil prices, short, long term?
In my base case, oil goes to 87 in 2 weeks, and then down to 77, and that's about it.
Everyone's everyone's taking notes, and we're gonna reinvite you in 2 weeks.
Yeah, exactly. On the if there's if there's an escalation, then I think we can easily go to 160, 170. Because it's an extra 6 million barrels that drop if there's escalation, right? 2 million of Iranian barrels that no longer get exported, plus 4 million that go through Yanbu, through the Red Sea. That's 6 million barrels more that disappear.
How do you see the effect on a country like Egypt? They are not involved physically in the conflict, but economically, apparently, they're affected.
Yeah, so I think very similar answer to the oil, which is in my base case, Egypt will be fine because the conflict will end. And in fact, it will be further reinforced because once again, like with Gaza, it will have proven to be a reliable partner for the US and for the Gulf. Sort of like there when you need it kind of thing, right? The problem is if the war escalates, then the Houthis will enter. The Suez Canal will close once again, I mean, de facto. And and Egypt will be in a very, very dire situation. So it's very binary, is what I'm trying to say.
Who do you believe is winning this conflict as of today?
Iran. But as of today is
And
critical.
why?
Yeah, I
And
mean, so
why?
why is basically because it has shown that conventional military capabilities, where the US totally dominates, are not relevant or not sufficient. So that's why. But I think the critical part of the question is today, because like I mentioned a couple of times, I think Iran is also smart enough to understand that if the war continues, its leverage will go down, diminishing returns for Iran. So the winning move actually for Iran is to take the win right now. It's not to milk it until they get destroyed.
Again, I promise to ask as much as possible questions. We still have 21 minutes. We'll use them wisely. In the name of transparency, there's a question saying, if we see capital flying out of the GCC, or more specifically Dubai, where could it go?
Oof. Singapore. Um, yeah, I mean Singapore or the US. Dollar strengthening, etc. Um, that's how I would think about it.
Do you think that the Japanese, the Chinese, and the Indians governments, of course, and countries have a special agreement with Iran to permit safe passage through the Strait of Hormuz for their vessels?
So I I don't know if they have it or not, but I do think that even if they have it, they are not happy with it. It's not sufficient to them, right? So it doesn't. My point here is it doesn't create a new equilibrium where the main players have a deal, so it doesn't really matter if Europe and the US don't have a deal. Like they will just be disproportionately hit. I think if you're China again, it's great if you can get your 2 million barrels of Iranian oil, but you would love to get your other 3 million barrels of everything oil, right? And same with Iran, like with India, like, okay, we can have 6 ships go by, but we usually have 600. So, I mean, yeah, so I don't think it's a solution. Even take aside normative, even from a market perspective, I don't think it's a solution.
Why is Trump sending troops and negotiating at the same time? Is this a strategy of buying time or pressurizing tactics?
Yeah. So, I mean, first, to be clear, I'm very, very, very aware that it's possible I'm just wrong and he's just buying time and he's going to attack for sure. Right. So I recognize that possibility. But I think the explanation can be simpler, potentially, which is number one, if you ordered troops, so basically you started the war, he started the war, he realized he screwed up because he didn't have any troops to do anything in the strait. So he ordered his troops to go, right? And then he sees an opening to potentially try to de-escalate because Egypt and Pakistan and Turkey are helping him out. And he decides, okay, I would love to de-escalate because this is getting out of hand. He's not going to cancel the troops. Of course not. Like any good poker player is going to keep the troops coming. Like it's ridiculous. You need a fallback, you need leverage, etc. And then the second potential explanation is I could see a scenario where, in fact, a very likely scenario where we get a deal, but Trump is still going to want to keep troops in the region to make sure that Iran sticks to the deal, right? If the deal is Iran agrees to reopen Hormuz in exchange for not getting bombed, Trump is not going to want to send all the troops back home and then lose all the leverage again. So I think there's multiple potential explanations. It's not necessarily that he plans to attack, is my point.
You're allowed to drink, by the way. How do you see the Lebanon situation? Is this going to turn into another Gaza and keep the region on edge for this?
So another Gaza, I don't think so because I think I don't know how to say this. I think the Lebanese lobby is more important than the Gaza lobby, than the Palestinian lobby. I mean, whether it be in the US or whether it be in European capitals or whether it be in Middle Eastern capitals. And you can also replace the word lobby because it's not an organized lobby with just diaspora or influence or soft power. Doesn't matter what word you use, it is, and unfairly so in some ways, it is more unacceptable when Israel bombs Beirut than when Israel bombs, uh, any city like Khan Yunis or something, right? So I don't think it's going to become Gaza, but I also don't think that the war is going to end easily or sustainably. So, for example, let's say that Lebanon is part of a peace deal with Iran or a ceasefire with Iran. The ceasefire would basically be Iran gets a concession from the US that Israel will stay south of Litani for the next year. But there will come a time when Israel will want to go north of Litani, right? So this conflict is not solved. I think it's going to linger is the problem, is the point.
Which means occupation in both answers.
Yeah.
How do you assess the potential impact of a helium supply disruption, particularly linked to the situation in Qatar, on the AI infrastructure build out in the US, given that TSMC relies on helium sourced from the region, mainly Qatar, and is a critical supplier to NVIDIA and AMD? Could this create a bottleneck in the semiconductor supply chain supporting AI growth?
Yes. And I think it's one of the many reasons, like we were discussing earlier, why Trump understands that 3 weeks of war is not the same as 3 months of war. That there's a tipping point, right? You can have 3 weeks of war and the UAE confirms actually, don't worry, we're still going to invest. But if you have 3 months or 3 years, it becomes harder.
Do you believe Trump will be okay with countries such as China and Japan paying for goods coming through the strait in Chinese yuan?
I think Trump doesn't have enough leverage to be able to make it a priority. And so I'm sure you've seen this. Whenever Trump meets a challenge that's too big for him to tackle, he just ignores it. So all he has to do is say nothing about it.
Do you expect the GCC countries to get involved in the war? And what would be the likely outcomes if such escalation took place?
I So first of all, as I'm sure you know, there's quite a bit of this discussion that this may already be happening. So that's one potential answer, in which case the question is moot. As regards Saudi Arabia in particular, I think that until and unless the Houthis enter the war, that threat, that leverage, that fear will be sufficient to keep Saudi out of the war officially, because there's just too much to lose. And if they do enter, I actually don't think that there will be that dramatic of a situation of a change. Like for example, what I'm saying is I don't think that if Qatar formally enters the war, suddenly all 14 LNG trains get destroyed or whatever. I think it will remain a tit for tat.
Okay. How empowered is Putin through this conflict, and what does it mean for the Ukraine war?
So he is empowered. It reduces the likelihood, however you assessed it before, 0% or 30% that he would make any major concessions. But the Russians have, ever since day one, they've always understood that nothing lasts forever. And so they themselves don't get too excited when, Trump eases sanctions or whatever. They don't suddenly think, oh, okay, he's on our side. We're going to have support for the next 2 years. They understand that everything can flip within 6 weeks.
Two questions on gold. Is it still a safe haven, and what explains the drop in the price?
I think it's still a safe haven, and what explains the drop in the price is the froth. So it's basically Nvidia is an amazing company, but amazing company, doesn't justify a 200 multiple or whatever. Is basically what it is. And I think the profile of gold buyers had changed dramatically in the past 6 months, and that explains the drop in the price more so than the fundamentals of gold. So in the short term, it breaks correlations, but I don't think it necessarily reveals a new meaning or whatever.
Would you say the same about silver?
Um, I would say the same about silver, yes. Though I don't know that I would ever have seen silver as a safe haven. So I would say the same logic about not seeing the asset profile change dramatically. That's different than saying that it was a safe haven or is a safe haven.
I realize we're asking you to be a geopolitician, an economist, everything we're asking you to be today. So I realize that, but thank you so much for addressing all these questions. We still have 12 minutes. How likely is Iran to target desalination infrastructure in the region, and what would be the depth of the resulting economic impact?
Yeah, I think if the war continues, if the U.S. Tries to take Kharg Island or this or that, like the escalation scenarios suggest, so not our base case, but plausible. Yes, I think Iran will do that, and I think it will be absolutely apocalyptically bad. I mean, the Gulf will survive, but it will be a catastrophe.
Why do you say Kharg Island takeover is difficult for the US?
Um, because for a couple of reasons. One is it's not uninhabited, so you start having to basically like do population control and all this kind of stuff, and potentially counterinsurgency warfare. So it's really boots on the ground in the traditional land war scenario or sense. Sorry, which is quite different than you take a couple minuscule islands in the Strait of Hormuz just to have a base to set up like a drone anti-drone system or something, right? It's very different. And then the second reason is because it's so physically close to the mainland that you can get hit with, like, for example, fiber optic cable drones that you can't scramble. So it's just a very vulnerable position to be in.
Do you anticipate a decline in foreign investors' demand for long-term assets such as real estate and infrastructure and data center in the Gulf countries, even if the current conflict is resolved?
Yes. Yes. Not from 100 to 0, but the way I would think about it is not from 100 to 0, not even from 100 to 50, but from 140% demand to 75% demand.
What is the best scenario for Saudi Arabia, UAE, Qatar, Bahrain, Kuwait for the long term?
So I think the best case scenario is no one knows, everyone knows that Mujtaba Khamenei is a hardliner in the sense that he was involved in repression and he's, a hardcore part of the system, etc. But we don't know how he wants to behave. Like what I mean by that is it is not inconceivable that he comes out and he says, guys, we had to bomb you because there was war, but actually we want to go back to the status quo ante. No one's going to believe him, to be clear. I'm not naive, right? But that he tries to pursue that policy. He basically says, let's put the past behind us. Let's move on. Let's do joint security. We want to make this work. And again, I'm not an idiot. I'm not naive. No one is going to believe him. But that's better than the alternative. It's better than him coming out every day and saying, if you allow alcohol to be consumed in Dubai, I'm going to close Hormuz, right? Like, and no one has information on this, on how he wants to behave. So the best case scenario is he comes out of his coma or whatever, or takes his bandages off, and turns out to be not a dove, but a pragmatist.
If the Iranian regime eventually falls in a few years, does that embolden Israel in terms of expanding its borders?
So expanding is I'm maybe naively not of the view that Israel's goals are primarily territorial about Greater Israel and this and that. I think the goals are that there is a degree of imperialism or overstretch or expansion. Expansionism is the word I'm looking for. But I do think that actually, ironically, very similar to Iran, it's a offense is the best defense logic. I think this is debatable. Everyone has their own opinion, but I don't think of Israel as wanting to acquire as much as possible. I think of Israel as wanting to push out the risks as much as possible, which in Israel's mind means being aggressive, showing teeth, right? Well, more than showing teeth.
There has been several false flags attacks. What's your take on the recent Diego Garcia attack?
Um, I don't have a sufficiently convincing argument or proof to judge either way.
How does this conflict impact the Gulf sovereign wealth fund's ambitions on converting oil into data by building data centers in the Gulf? I think you already touched on it earlier.
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's a headwind in the sense that there will be less multiplier effect from foreign interest. But obviously, the Gulf sovereign wealth funds, and not just sovereign wealth funds, capital in the Gulf, including privates, is sufficient enough to do this on their own. So it basically means, it's like entering any kind of venture where instead of having partners to spread the risk, you have to do it all on your own. That doesn't mean you're going to fail.
Why have the Houthis not entered the war yet to
So I
support
think,
Iran?
yeah, I think there's this big debate: do the Houthis answer to Iran or not? And did they not enter because Iran asked them and they refused? I think it's not a yes or no. It's not a either or. I think it's very likely. I was going to say possible, but actually likely that the Houthis are reluctant to enter the war because they don't want to put a target on their back. They're not a puppet of Iran, et cetera, et cetera. And therefore, that's partly why they have said no so far. But that doesn't mean that they will say no forever. So, for example, if Trump tries to take Karg Island, I think the Houthis will say, okay, it's go time, right?
Unlike Venezuela, where you topple one strong man and the system falls, Iran's clerical ruling class is over 15,000 deep with only 7 regime changes in 6,000 years of history. So that's the question from someone who knows well their history and geography about Iran. Given that structural reality, are Washington and Tel Aviv pursuing a strategy with no viable endgame?
Short version, yes. The short version is yes. And in fact, both, including Israel, are recognizing it, as I'm sure you've seen in the various leaks. The longer answer is longer answer is they didn't topple the regime in Venezuela, right? What they did was get the regime to find, not to comply. They didn't force Venezuela. They got the regime to see upside in collaborating or complying, right? Um, and it's not inconceivable that you would find some mutually agreeable upside going forward. Like, what I mean by that, again, going back to the base case. The base case is not that Iran like suddenly capitulates and gives all its weapons, right? But if Trump says reopen Hormuz and we'll give you $10 billion under the table, that's what I would call, it's kind of like a Venezuela outcome, right?
What would be a realistic? Now we get to the last question, which would be giving us hope, or maybe one before last. What would be a realistic peace deal acceptable to Iran and the US and the region?
I think it is U.S. stops bombing Iran in exchange for Iran reopening Hormuz and not threatening to close it. Everyone is more or less unhappy. Everyone starts building up their defenses, and then how long you have peace versus return to war will be purely tactical, i.e., the underlying equilibrium will not be stable, but you can have peace for 10 years without a stable equilibrium, right?
How will the United States and the GCC relationship progress from here?
Uh, I think very similar to before, which is this awkward situation where the Gulf understands and realizes that it cannot trust the US fully, but at the same time, no one is offering a better alternative. So, does the Gulf feel satisfied with the air defense systems that and supplies that have been provided? No. Does the Gulf think that Trump is a reliable partner? No. Is China better? Absolutely not. Is Russia better? Absolutely not. Is Israel better? Absolutely not. Right?
Do you think or believe that the Trump-related risk premium should be incorporated into the valuation of various investment types?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely.
And I would like to end with this question. How do you expect the global order to evolve in light of perceived breaches of international law by major powers? In particular, what are the implications for the credibility of international legal frameworks, cohesion among Western developed countries, and the future trajectory recalibration of US GCC relations, considering the spillover effects of the GCC were arguably foreseeable?
So easy question, right? To wrap up. I think we're in this bizarre situation where because of the total breakdown of basically because of the rise of might makes right, you're in a situation where everyone is just arming up, right? Weapons, weapons, weapons. But then you have conflicts like this current one that also remind us that the old school weapons don't work or are not sufficient. So one answer to the question is, I think, a pivot to arming up, but in an innovation and asymmetrical way. The cliche being, but it's a cliche, but it's true, being what the Ukrainians have done with drones, I think is more or less the future we're headed for.
And the last one, what will happen? What will happen to the Abraham Accords signed a few years back?
I think no change. My sense is that, analytically speaking, surprisingly, there seems to there seems to be limited buyer's remorse on the UAE's part. I say
Andrew,
that,
if you've never,
yeah.
okay, go ahead, please.
No, I say that not as a normal statement, but because of the cost that has come with it. Right, the cost has been high, but it seems the UAE is willing to pay that cost.
If you never sat for the CFA exam, Andrew, this looked like a level 1 or level 2 exam where we give you less than a few seconds to answer very difficult questions. So this is a CFA exam-like situation. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it. It's one of the most sessions I've ever enjoyed about geopolitics. We asked you to be so many hats, so many experts, and you brilliantly responded to everything. Really, thank you. We had tons of questions. We have at some point 125 people in the room, hundreds of questions. I think we tried to answer all of those. I would like to thank you very much. Thank Signum and thank CFA Society Emirates, Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, and Oman for a great, great session. Thank you so much. Hopefully, another one in a couple of weeks to see if your
Yeah,
projections worked. Thank you so
exactly.
much. Thanks for
Thank
everyone
you.
for dialing in.
Thank you so much.